All right. Welcome, everybody, folks, to 52 Living Ideas and Comprehensivist Wednesdays. We're doing this in collaboration with CJ and the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. Today, we'll be talking about multiple hypotheses, and CJ is going to lead the charge. The format is there are going to be two-part presentations. So CJ will present the basic idea of multiple hypotheses, and then there'll be breakout rooms. And then he's going to make another presentation on connecting the multiple hypotheses to comprehensivism. And then we'll do one more breakout room, after which we're going to come back together in the large group to share our takeaways. All right, so that's the format. So over to CJ.
Okay, welcome to Comprehensivist Wednesdays. It's a weekly series of events to foster the art of comprehensivity. That is the art of striving to understand all and put everything together, as Buckminster Fuller described it. Our topic today is the value of multiple working hypotheses. But first, while people are still joining, I'm going to introduce a new project that we're working on next year. I'd like to invite you to join me on an epic 9-month adventure reading two of Dante Alighieri's great works between January 1st and mid-September 2021 to celebrate the 700th anniversary of the legacy Dante bequeathed us on his death in 1321. We will start by reading Dante's La Vita Nuova. I'll be reading an English translation. Dante's 1294 text about courtly love is important background for appreciating his magnum opus, which he entitled Commedia. You probably know it as the Divine Comedy. The word divine was added more than 200 years after Dante's death, and I think it distorts the presentation of what is, in fact, a very complex epic poem. Why should you read Dante? Because the Commedia is intricate, dramatic, thrilling, mind-blowing, cosmic, shocking, ineffable, sometimes oppressive, but altogether extraordinary. You should read it because Dante is one of the greatest poets in world history. Read it because it is one of the greatest works in world literature and is widely referenced by storytellers of all types all around the world. Read it to learn something of the complex poetics of one of the world's greatest poets. Read it to learn about the science, philosophy, politics, religion, and culture of the Middle Ages. Read it to learn about an influential work of European history, which speaks to the vibrancy of medieval culture and the history of romantic love. Read it to experience a journey through the liberal arts as Dante guides us through his encyclopedia of knowledge. Read it to learn how Dante imagines the interconnectedness and unity of knowledge, integrating the liberal arts and faith and reason in his tour de force. Read it to learn how one of our greatest poets envisions his pilgrimage to meet God face to face and return to tell us about it. I wrote a webpage to help us read Dante together in a semi-synchronized way. You can find a link from my social media feeds or on Comprehensivist Wednesdays. I'll be organizing the October 13th, yes, that's October of next year, 2021. Big ideas require big timelines. So you can find that event if you go to 52 Living Ideas or the Thinking Society, go to events, then the calendar, and go to October 2021. On the 13th, I've already got the event, Dante's Commedia and Our Comprehensivity. I might change the title. The skeletal event description has a link to my Reading Dante in 2021 page. Unfortunately, I won't have time to organize many additional events, so the Shrikant and I just decided January 6th we're going to talk about Dante's legacy. Other than those two events, I probably won't be doing much. So I would invite a group of you to step up and help us organize additional events on the text. Maybe you can help by writing discussion questions, or maybe you can interpret the text, or you might be a panelist in an event, or you could present ideas to start the conversation, whatever you think you can do. I feel that some participants would prefer to have some regular events on the text. It's going to be harder to stay synchronized and keep going if we don't talk to each other about it regularly. So if you can help us organize, maybe weekly, that might be too ambitious, or bi-weekly, or at least monthly events on Dante for the 7th centenary of his death. It's going to take your help to pull it off. I can help coordinate a little bit and coach a team of co-organizers, but I don't have time to attend, let alone organize events. So let us know how you can help. The plan is to read the poem at the slow rate of 3 cantos per week. There are 100 cantos in total. Hopefully that can accommodate even those of you with busy schedules. At that pace, it will take us 9 months to go through it. It will be epic. So, to move 5.5 centuries forward from 1321 to 1890, today's topic, as I mentioned, is the value of multiple working hypotheses. It is based on a short essay that T.C. Chamberlain published in 1890 in the journal Science. Let me motivate the conversation with comprehensivism. To develop our comprehensivism, our efforts at learning that are macro-comprehensive and micro-incisive, as Bucky Fuller put it in Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, we first need to find sources from which we can acquire knowledge. In previous events, I recounted 3 sources for comprehensivist learning. On July 29th, I introduced humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action, what is passed on from person to person and generation to generation. On October 4th, we explored Bucky Fuller's universe as the aggregate of all humanity's consciously apprehended and communicated experience. And on November 18th, we examined Wade Davis's ethnosphere as the sum total of all thoughts and dreams, ideas and myths, intuitions and inspirations brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. In brief, humanity's traditions, our communicated experiences, and the ethnosphere, our cultural zone, are the so far identified sources for our comprehensivist learning. From this enormous inventory of available wisdom, the aspiring comprehensivist now desires moral guidance to navigate and make sense of this, our vast cultural heritage. What should we do with all this knowledge? How are we to integrate it? Should we accept it all? Should we reject some of it? How should we assess this rapidly growing store of knowledge? To guide us in answering these questions, we would be aided by having criteria for reliable, dependable, or advantageous knowledge. Such criteria are called epistemic virtues, are criteria for good knowledge. Warning signs for suspicious, unreliable, or dangerous knowledge are called epistemic vices, are concerns about bad knowledge. In order to make sound interpretations and judgments about the knowledge we as comprehensivists are rapidly accumulating, we need competent moral guidance. Tonight, we will consider the moral reform urged by T.C. Chamberlain in his 1890 essay, The Method of Multiple Working Hypotheses. He says his method broadly applies to investigation, instruction, and citizenship. Chamberlain asserts that the thoroughness, the completeness, the all-sidedness, the impartiality should guide the moral sense of our investigations. These are also the epistemic virtues for comprehensivism. Chamberlain presents his method as the highest approach to learning yet attained. I am not convinced about his history of intellectual methods with its two predecessors, the ruling theory and the working hypothesis. However, as we shall see, his application of this rhetorical device to critique these alternatives is powerfully apt. In the case of the ruling theory, the investigator, the student, and the citizen choose their knowledge by adopting a ruling theory as their faithfully abided by true explanation. Whereas with the working hypothesis, we adopt provisionally a proposed theory as our tentative but preferred explanation. Chamberlain strongly criticizes both methods for suffering from the epistemic vice of precipitate explanation, theories put together with insufficient deliberation. It is a common affliction to this day. I myself admit to falling for this all too common vice from time to time. I'm sure you have been induced to premature conclusions as well. Chamberlain diagnoses the epistemic vice of precipitate explanation. He calls it the partiality of intellectual parentage, which we would now call confirmation bias. Here's a quote from Chamberlain. The moment one has offered an original explanation for a phenomenon which seems satisfactory, that moment, affection for his intellectual child springs into existence. There is an unconscious selection and magnifying of the phenomena that fall into harmony with the theory and support it, and an unconscious neglect of those that fail of coincidence. There spring up also an unconscious pressing of the theory to make it fit the facts, and a pressing of the facts to make them fit the theory. Chamberlain highlights the researcher devising their own novel explanations, but the same vice afflicts those who adopt the explanations of others as their ruling theory or working hypothesis. It is our affection for a theory or hypothesis that signals a dangerous epistemic vice, which Chamberlain characterizes as follows. If I were to name the central psychological fault, I should say that it was the admission of intellectual affection for the place that should be dominated by impartial intellectual rectitude. Chamberlain has identified the epistemic vice of intellectual affection as a great danger in our investigations, in our learning, and in our civic life. It is the identification of epistemic vices that tends to spur researchers to new and better ways of knowing, as Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison observe in their 2007 book, Objectivity. Likewise, Chamberlain's great advance in improving the scientific method also sprang from the recognition of an epistemic vice, the vice of intellectual affection. Chamberlain next proposes a remedy for the dangers of intellectual affection, namely his method of multiple working hypotheses, which impartially divides our affection among a family of possible explanations. If we diligently and conscientiously follow this method, our investigations may achieve an improved thoroughness and incisiveness or cuttingness of analysis, as Chamberlain argues. Quote, if all rational hypotheses relating to a subject are worked co-equally, thoroughness is the presumptive result in the very nature of the case. In the use of the multiple method, the reaction of one hypothesis upon another tends to amplify the recognized scope of each, and their mutual conflicts whet. Whet is an old-time word that means to sharpen. And their mutual conflicts whet the discriminative edge of each. The analytic process, the development and demonstration of criteria, and the sharpening of the discrimination receive powerful impulse from the coordinate working of several hypotheses. Chamberlain summarizes the benefits as follows. When faithfully pursued for a period of years, the method of multiple working hypotheses develops a habit of thought analogous to the method itself, which may be designated a habit of parallel or complex thought. The procedure is complex, and the mind appears to become possessed of the power of simultaneous vision from different standpoints. Phenomena appear to become capable of being viewed analytically and synthetically at once. This is a powerful benefit statement for the faculties of parallel and complex thought, simultaneous vision from different standpoints, and viewing phenomena analytically and synthetically at once. The investigator, the student, the citizen, and the comprehensivist would significantly improve their mental acuity if they could achieve these mental dexterities. Chamberlain warns of some drawbacks to the method. Since our language and our procedures are predominantly linear, there are difficulties in expressing and in investigating multiple hypotheses in a co-equal manner. Moreover, the process of weighing evidence for and against each of our multiple hypotheses may degenerate into unwarranted vacillation as we switch back and forth from one hypothesis to another. Nevertheless, Chamberlain recommends the method beyond the sphere of just investigation and learning. He says, I am confident, therefore, that the general application of this method to the affairs of social and civic life would go far to remove those misunderstandings, misjudgments, and misrepresentations which constitute so pervasive an evil in our social and our political atmospheres, the source of immeasurable suffering to the best and most sensitive souls. How apt this 1890 quote is to today's political atmosphere. Chamberlain concludes with a strong benefit statement for the method of multiple working hypotheses. The total outcome is greater care in ascertaining the facts and greater discrimination and caution in drawing conclusions. Chamberlain has made his case. We need to assess its merits. Ought we reform our morality by adopting the method of multiple working hypotheses as an important epistemic virtue guiding our assessment of knowledge? Why or why not? This is the question to guide your breakout. I will repeat it after Shrikant gets us ready for the breakout.
CJ, I have a clarification question.
Yeah.
What does he recommend? How does he recommend you come up with the list of multiple hypotheses? Is he, what is the source of it? Is there a number which is manageable? Would you have hundreds of hypotheses, or would you have a dozen or a few? Would you, if you found that the hypothesis, like one of the hypotheses is not at all working, would you let go of that? Would you incorporate new hypotheses? So this array of hypotheses that you work in, how do you choose? How does he recommend that you choose that?
Well, he it's only a 6-page paper. He doesn't examine all possible cases. He's just trying to indicate the overall idea that just because we're satisfied with one hypothesis that seems to work, we should really challenge ourselves to come up with a second or a third or maybe a fourth. Maybe you should go for many. I don't know. That's going to depend on whether on your social situation. If you have the luxury of coming up with hundreds, most people have to get on with their life. So, and he does talk in the paper. I highly recommend the paper. It's a very readable paper. Slightly archaic language, but it's really straightforward. It's not that difficult. There are very few archaic words, like wet, meaning to sharpen. So I would say that at the level of this advocacy paper, he's just saying, make sure you get 2 or 3 or 4 more than one. Don't settle for one. When you have one hypothesis that seems good, that's inadequate. You need at least 2 or 3 or 4. What the right number is going to depend on the maturity of the question. If you're examining a question that hasn't been examined before, it might be harder to imagine other hypotheses, so you might be satisfied with 3. If it's an area that's been studied in depth, there are probably already 25 in the books. So you should find them and get familiar with them.
Excellent. All right. So I'm ready with the breakout rooms. Could you please repeat the questions that you want people to consider during the breakout rooms?
Right. So in my presentation, I've summarized T.C. Chamberlain's method of multiple working hypotheses and as a moral reform. We are to assess its merits. Ought we reform our morality by adopting the method of multiple working hypotheses as an important epistemic virtue guiding our assessment of knowledge? Why or why not? In the breakouts, we want everyone to speak, so go around to all participants and ask them the question. If there's time, go around 2 or 3 times, clarifying and digging deeper.
Excellent. And then we will be back here in 20 minutes automatically for the second presentation, and then we'll do one more breakout rooms, and then we'll come back and we'll be sharing our takeaways of what we have learned from this meetup. I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back. All right, CJ, everybody's back. So on to the second part.
Right. So before I started on the second part, it became clear from my breakout that not everyone fully understood that hypotheses are proposed explanations. Theory is another word that kind of means the same thing as hypothesis, although usually with a theory we mean something that we're more confident of, whereas a hypothesis is a guess, And when we're trying to devise knowledge and we don't know the answer ahead of time, either we're a student who maybe the answer's known, but we don't know it, or we're an investigator, a researcher, a thinker, an explorer. We don't know the answer. And the methods, dating back even to Greek times with Aristotle, are that you use hypotheses. And the essay, the first presentation, was that these hypotheses, these proposed explanations, when you just have one and you treat it with affection, Chamberlain, the essayist, the geologist who wrote this essay that I inspired my presentation, warns that that's a danger, and that his recommendation is that we should intentionally strive to adopt multiple working hypotheses before and deliberate before we settle on an explanation that we're more confident of. And of course, then you get into more elements of the scientific method, such as testing and reproducibility and all the other parts of the scientific method. So maybe I didn't make that clear enough. For the second presentation, I want to examine the multiple working hypothesis method and comprehensivism. So what is the value of Chamberlain's method of multiple working hypotheses for someone practicing comprehensivism, working to ever more extensively and ever more intensively understand all and understand each other? I've already indicated that Chamberlain advocates important qualities of comprehensivism. In particular, he emphasizes thoroughness, completeness, all-sidedness, and impartiality. These are important epistemic virtues guiding comprehensivism, as well as for Chamberlain guiding our investigations, our learning, and our citizenship. In addition, consider Chamberlain's multi-perspectival benefit statement for multiple working hypotheses, namely that the power of simultaneous vision from different standpoints, where phenomena can be viewed analytically and synthetically at once. Analytic means intensively focusing on the parts in depth, and synthetic means extensively integrating the parts as a broadly considered whole. Chamberlain's statement is powerful in its support of depth and breadth, which is a key feature of comprehensivism. But I think it fails to integrate Buckminster Fuller's principle of synergy, that is the idea that the behavior of the whole is unpredictable from the behavior of its parts considered separately. But let's go further. The method of multiple working hypotheses provides, I claim, an efficient approach to learning. The comprehensivist, guided by this approach, can accumulate a large inventory of knowledge as we study humanity's traditions, from our communicated experiences, and from the ethnosphere, our cultural zone, that these can be compared and contrasted to, as Chamberlain puts it, whet or sharpen the discriminative edge of each. As you compare and contrast these different things we learn from different cultures, from different traditions, from different experiences, we can understand each through the contrast of the other. In contrast, the usual approach to learning depends on building knowledge brick upon brick to allegedly ensure sound foundations at every step. The comprehensivist approach, inspired by Chamberlain's multiple working hypotheses, can produce more options, more hypotheses, more possible explanations to consider. And that may provide more discriminative edges with which to sharpen our understanding and more perspectives to consider. This can give our considerations more flexibility, resilience, and accuracy. If we diligently practice handling each of a family of hypotheses co-equally, we will neither overstate them nor lose sight of our ignorance. As we learn more and more and sharpen the discriminative edge of each against the others, our analytic and synthetic powers may grow. That's what Chamberlain tells us. We may develop sophisticated understandings of the interrelationships of a vast array of hypotheses, which the more specialized or pedantic learner may never even consider. We may even develop the ability to ask embarrassing questions of those whose context and experience hasn't enlivened their imaginations to consider such diverse possibilities. When this approach of multiple working hypotheses is combined with diverse groups of people engaging in dialogue to explore and assess our combined knowledge, our collective understanding may quickly develop new meanings, form new insights, and forge new possibilities. We may find that collaborating to broadly and deeply explore humanity's accumulated wisdom is more effective than more focused approaches to learning. This is the idea of collaborating for comprehensivism, to bring a knowledge revolution to our citizenry through learning to make sense of it all and each other by engaging the vast array of sources of comprehensivist learning, guided by T.C. Chamberlain's epistemic virtue of multiple working hypotheses. But there's a little problem hidden in this aspirational project statement. A basic principle for sound knowledge has been, until now, the assiduous application of the principle of non-contradiction. A comprehensivist, co-equally and impartially considering, say, atheism and theology, conservative and liberal principles, or even something like zero as the nothing that exists, runs smack into the problem that the principle of non-contradiction is sometimes in conflict with the principle of multiple working hypotheses. How can we resolve this conflict among our epistemic virtues? I think the answer comes from Buckminster Fuller. He said, "Don't try to make me consistent. I'm learning all the time." And that's the key idea, learning. Learning, investigation, exploration, and civic life are common situations wherein contradictory hypotheses may be encountered. And if we're going to take seriously Chamberlain's moral guidance and co-equally and impartially explore them, but they're contradictory, the comprehensivist might be forced to accept or even embrace contradictions to avoid the harm of prematurely winnowing out our hypotheses because they happen to be contradictory. Angela Catalessa's PhD thesis includes a wonderful quote from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." It may be that our aversion to contradictions is misplaced. Forestalling contradictions may short-circuit our explorations and compromise our comprehensivist learning. Our predilection for consistency may lead us to over-specialize or otherwise fail to consider the full range of possibilities. Chamberlain's epistemic virtue of multiple working hypotheses may be the more important value for our learning. In sum, T.C. Chamberlain recommended the epistemic virtue of multiple working hypotheses to better ascertain the facts and to improve our caution and our effectiveness in drawing conclusions. He recommends this approach to increase the thoroughness of our investigations and our learning, to improve our ability to see from multiple perspectives, and to simultaneously see both analytically and synthetically. He recommends it broadly applying to our investigation, our instruction, and our citizenship. For the comprehensivist, striving to understand it all and each other, ought the method of multiple working hypotheses be a fundamental epistemic principle for assessing our knowledge. Despite its difficulties in accommodating our linear language and our linear actions, despite its danger of degenerating into unwarranted vacillation, despite how it may burden us with conflicts, inconsistencies, and contradictions, despite how it demands that we treat each of our favorite ruling theories and our favorite working hypotheses co-equally and impartially by putting them to the test with a battery of additional working hypotheses. In short, should we apply the method of multiple working hypotheses as a primary moral principle in the practice of our comprehensivism, despite its drawbacks and challenges? That's your question for the second breakout. I'll repeat it after Shrikant gets us ready.
Right, folks. So we're going to do the second breakout. Again, let everybody have a couple of minutes to say their thoughts, and then so that everybody gets to participate and you can learn from everybody. And then we'll be back here in 20 minutes, after which we'll be doing takeaways. So each person will be able to talk about what they think about this multiple working hypothesis method, and what did you learn from this meetup today. So CJ, please go ahead and repeat the question, and then I'll start the breakout rooms.
Should we apply the method of multiple working hypotheses as a primary moral principle in the practice of our comprehensivism, despite its drawbacks and challenges?
Wonderful. So that's the question. I'm starting the breakout rooms now.
It was interesting.
Wonderful. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. CJ, are you back?
Yes.
Excellent. So folks, we are now going into takeaway section. This is the takeaway section. So please take 2 minutes each. So I'm going to call upon people as I see them in my Zoom. And I'm going to start with, let me see. I'm going to start with Jeff, Todd, and Stephen Bertoloni. And the question is, so take about 2 minutes to share your thoughts, hopes, concerns, reflections, takeaways, and or questions. Whatever you want to leave the group with as your concluding comment on tonight's exploration of the value of multiple working hypotheses. All right, so let's start with Jeff, Todd, and Stephen. Jeff.
So I think this is a phenomenal session. CJ, the only thing I'm worried about is that I'm too in love with the idea of maintaining multiple working hypotheses. One of the things that Mike shared just at the end of our breakout room there was, it may be that it's important that we hold a principle of don't assassinate the person who comes up with the wrong hypotheses. And I think that this balance of having confidence to be able to act on the things that we need to act on that are useful and important in the context of any given moment and challenges and opportunities in front of us, but at the same time, stay very humble about the fact that we don't know what we don't know. Both things that are in our control, and even things that maybe, and certainly things that are outside of our control. So it is that balance between confidence and humility and continuous learning, with everything being an experiment. And I think, if anything, my new religion is based on iteration.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. Next up is Todd, Stephen, and Sandy. Todd.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, everyone, for letting me crash the party. It's been enlightening, as much of philosophy is. I think the takeaways for me were, as Jeff eloquently mentioned, being humble as we go through scientific process. I'm in the field of marketing research, and while we apply marketing lens to things, a little bit different, but still, we have to have multiple working hypotheses as we go through. And I love the idea of applying humility throughout this and keeping your mind open to things that bubble up. And I think it's really important that that even when we find things that maybe we didn't predict or hypothesize going on, that we don't try and confirm that with our own biases. That we don't, and this is the whole notion of black swan events and all of those things, that things can happen and can occur by accident, and that we don't actually have to predict everything, that things can actually happen. And so I like the process of the process myself, and if that makes sense. And I think that's one of the key takeaways for me. I'll just leave it there. But
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Todd. And you can crash the party anytime. We do this every day. Next up is Stephen, Sandy, and Lynn. Stephen.
Well, I have two questions. I've been having trouble with the mic today. Can you hear me well?
There is a terrible echo. So could you try to fix the echo? Do you know how to fix it?
I know. I'm fine with other calls, but it has been locally all day, so.
It is impossible to hear you because there is a tremendous echo. Could you type your takeaway in the chat? I would read it out for you. Thank you. Next up is Sandy, Lynn, and David. Sandy.
Okay, the most important insight that I got during this discussion tonight is that the alternative working hypotheses may be contradictory, but they may both be right. They may both be wrong, and we don't know. And as other people have said, to maintain humility and balance is very important. But I think it's also human nature is that we do get attached to our earliest ideas, and that the best way to deal with that when we're working in science and technology is to have groups of people working on projects together. But even in those cases, there is a time for multiple hypotheses, and there is a time to winnow down the number of working hypotheses and work on the most likely alternatives. And the idea that maybe we should be working on more than one whenever that's economically feasible, that's very appealing. I think that's an important takeaway, that the number of working hypotheses may be unknown as to what's optimum, but it's clear that it's not one. And any number greater than one would seem to be of benefit in terms of maintaining an open mind and soliciting new ideas from other people, from other perspectives, and that there's a time to do it and there's a time to move on. And so putting emphasis on the working hypothesis, these are not the final conclusions. These are not the theories that we're going to engrave in stone. These are, in fact, working hypotheses that we need to have lots of.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you. Great observations. Next up is Lynn, David, and Marisa. Lynn.
I'm Rick. I'm on my wife's Lynn's iPad.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. I found this very interesting. There was one young woman in our group who tried very carefully to listen to CJ's questions, and she did a very good job of bringing us back to answering CJ's questions. So I appreciate that. I don't know her name. I'm sorry. I'm a physician. There's a horrible lack of humility in medicine. Atul Gawande, this neurosurgeon who writes for the New Yorker, writes about the lack of humility in medicine. And I think I recommend that to you, his book to you. The phrase, I'll research who said this, only humility is infinite. Only humility is infinite. That phrase rings true to me, and I've tried to live that way. And from a practical standpoint, I suggest to all of you as you work with your doctors, please respect the doctor who says periodically, I just don't know. I'm here to care for you, but I don't know the answer to your question. If you don't have a doctor who has that humility periodically, I would say fire that doctor and move on to someone else. So that's a piece of practical advice. But I wanted to thank you, sir, and CJ for hosting a very interesting evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick. I want to read out the comment of Stephen. He says, two thoughts. The issue is to distinguish between people trying to evaluate knowledge versus those with other agendas or goals. I think many of the people in this group already accept contradictions as an initial stage seeking knowledge and are less likely to rule out competing hypotheses prematurely. Thank you, Stephen. Next up is going to be David and Marija. David, go ahead. David R.
Oh, okay. Yeah, first I want to thank CJ for a great presentation. And I really enjoyed the selection that he did this week. Very thought-provoking as I was reading the article today for the paper. I guess my takeaway is I noticed a common expression of humility. And I kind of reflected on that. And my takeaway would be that I should, with my own processes and pursuits, is keep in mind looking at alternatives, not focusing on a single aspect, but look for multiple thoughts, multiple approaches, in essence, multiple hypotheses as I pursue something. Because over time, I think by looking at multiple ideas, I will have enriched my exploration of that particular subject or that particular area. So it was I found it to be a very inspirational evening tonight, and something to reflect on as I move forward in some of my own areas of interest. So thanks again, CJ. Great subject.
Thank you, David. Next up is Marisa, Joe Rosato, and Wayne. Marisa.
More so than the essay from Chamberlain, what I really enjoyed was CJ's tying together of this essay with our comprehensivist topics from previous weeks. I could just see it. It's fantastic. I love the call that this essay is putting out to everyone for us to strive for increased objectivity and like thought-provoking conceptualizations on a variety of concepts when considering not just the technical, but also the personal and the potentially excitable, as it were. Because that's what I see that this is saying to us. It's saying, as do scientists, as do these technical people with this formal terminology of hypotheses, as they're going through that scientific method, we urge you to go ahead and make your own, multiple methods here for your own hypotheses, but to use it for things that are closer to home, as it were. Like, take this thing that the technical world has adopted as standard and internalize it and use it for everything you approach. And in doing so, this will become your habit. And what I see the value in this is that the muscle memory of making this your habit when looking at something that's potentially an explosive thing or a super emotional thing, it forces you in essence to do a virtual step back because you have to look at it from another perspective. And if you make that your habit, well, now you're not just improving yourself, you become a more a better person, but your interactions with everyone else and everything else are improved because you're doing this approach. And I just think that's a great idea. And that's what I view this essay as, a plea. And it's also a kind of a banner for saying, as a comprehensivist, you develop more tools with which to make better hypotheses for a variety of situations. And I think that's a beautiful concept. Thank you, CJ.
Excellent, Marisa. Thank you. Next up is Joe Rosato, Wayne, and Mark H. Joe.
Yeah, the multiple hypothesis, the part that I had emphasized and I think is very important, and I think this is likely also connected to what Sandy was mentioning a moment ago, but that we're all stuck in our subjective views, and there could be multiple narratives about many things. And since we really don't, language is an attempt to connect to the outside world, but it's language, it's not connecting, it's attempting to. So it's better to probably try to understand things from multiple, I use the word narratives, hypothesis, either of these words work, and you'll probably get closer to the truth with multiple narratives. It's sort of like when you see someone passes away and you don't know about the person, but you get a story from the 20 people that knew him or knew that person or whatever. And each of the stories are really out there, but after the 20, you have a general idea, which is probably closer to the truth than if one person just talked to you. And I think this touches upon that multiple hypothesis, because it's a limitation of language, and allowing the multiple, I think, allows a better understanding of what you're actually looking at, what you're actually, whatever the topic is. So, good talk, CJ, as always.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Wayne, Mark H., and Jean. Wayne.
I like the idea. I've always tried to consider different explanations for things. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to hear this talk. It's kind of like the old debater thing. You gain a better understanding of an issue if you kind of debate it from both sides and see it from different ways. The problem is, I'm not sure how practical it will be for most things. It takes a while to come up with different explanations, and it's not just coming up with the explanation, because the probability wave eventually has to collapse if you're going to make a decision. Consider 5 or 6 explanations, but if you're going to do anything, you have to have one explanation for it. So it's a very, very good idea to keep in mind, not staying dogmatic with one idea, but considering other ideas also is kind of a habit, as one of our speakers talked about. If you do it often enough, it's not really that difficult. It becomes muscle memory.
Thank you, Wayne. Next up is Mark H., Jean, and Mike. Mark.
Yeah, so I think that we're talking about the contradictions that come from the perspectives, and I was saying in the other breakout room that I think the Hegel brought that out a lot. The idea that I think the virtue of multiple perspectives is manifold. One, it can bring contradictions, which are good and they're important, because the contradictions, in order curate the potential for their resolution somehow, and that's through the resolution of contradictions that we can gain a higher level of knowledge. And then there's also the virtue of being able to use a perspective to critique another perspective. And I think it's this critique of perspectives through other perspectives that gives us a deeper level of knowledge too. And the more we multiply the perspectives, I think the more we get to a deeper level of truth, because things become less substantial. So we understand that everything is interdependent. If I was saying in the room, if you really understand that whenever we explain something, we're explaining some phenomena with reference to some other phenomena. And ultimately, it's going to either end up being circular, that one phenomena will relate to another and will eventually come back to itself, or it'll have to be an infinite regress, or there has to be something that transcends all the phenomena. So I think the more perspectives we have, the more unsubstantial each one becomes, and we begin to see how it's really it becomes sort of vaporized, and that there's something deeper that we can never conceptualize or even hypothesize, and that transcends any kind of knowledge, at least within our finite, unless we maybe get some higher levels of attainment spiritually that transcend the intellect and our sensuous perceptions. So the multiplicity of hypotheses could be a route to that higher level of spiritual attainment, because it shows that everything else is very limited and can become self-referential eventually, and can become a dead end. But from a practical point of view, I think they're important. But there's one pitfall, is that the ability to have conviction is important, and an intellectual intuition. In relation to morality, I was suggesting that ultimately morality has to be based upon some intellectual or some intuition, something that's axiomatic, and that the multiple perspectives in terms of morality would be about having to situate particular actions, but with reference to the axiom, and that the axiom of morality wouldn't be a hypothetical. It would be something that you'd have to intuit that's axiomatic. But
thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Next up is Jean, Mike, and Sanjay. Jean?
Yeah, was with CJ in the second breakout room. So this is very academic, and I agree the view in general. Like I think especially recently discussed a different group about how globalization nowadays they encounter so many conflicts socially. And I think the reason is people have their own view. If we are not open to other hypotheses, then there's no way people can get agreement, because people are limited. Even we can, as people here are more open, they can open to more views, but I see a lot of people are not. Like I encounter a lot of religious group people, they just think their God is only God, other God are not real God. So those kind of like, they have only one hypothesis. So I think from this, it's very important, especially today, this globalization, every need to have more, at least open to other hypotheses, to consider that, to make it possible to even start conversation. But in practical view, if you want to action, you actually, after review all the options, you have to stick with one thing to move forward. Seems more efficient.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Next up is Mike, Julie, and Kondapalli. Mike.
Okay.
Mike, you're still unmuted.
Okay. As I think has already been alluded, it's almost impossible to set aside the confirmation bias issue. And when you absolutely need the right answer, what ends up happening is the way science is funded today, the structure of how funding of science sets up multiple projects, multiple people, even multiple large teams to try these different paradigms, and then sets up a structure to evaluate the results and to write a statement of work that kind of focuses people together. And I've been on both sides, probably all 5 sides of that issue. And an example of what went on is what ended up happening in developing the vaccine for COVID-19. There were 12 teams funded and encouraged, and the statement of work that was written by NIH, who's the head of NIH is Francis Collins, who was the prime mover behind mapping the human genome, among other things. And now that gets the people involved to be champions of their own and of their own theories, and got the funding to put it together, because that was something that we absolutely positively needed to get. Now, that's a 2-hour lecture, but there's something interesting about T.C. Chamberlain's life. I've heard of him before. We've talked about Penrose. Penrose was Hawking's thesis advisor, who discovered the black holes. He also was involved in figuring out how the mind works, and the fact that the seat of the brain is not the neurons, but the synapses between the neurons. T.C. Chamberlain was studied to be a Methodist minister. He spoke fluent Greek and Latin, was familiar with the classics in the original language. He got interested in geology as a polymath. He became head of the Illinois Geographic Society. He became head of the USGS. He collaborated with John Wesley Powell, who started National Geographic, among other things. And what he did is he discovered a theory of why the glaciers were melting, which has been taken off in our entire preoccupation with global warming right now. He was concerned that it would get too far, and so after he came up with this theory, and it wasn't an individual effort, it was a large effort. He won the Penrose Award by a young guy giving the Penrose Award to an old guy for this theory in 1924. At any rate, Chamberlain, I'll bring this to a complete close. I see the sign,
yes.
The hook. Chamberlain lived his life, and the controversy that he started is still a controversy, and has proponents on both sides of it's the greatest disaster to ever happen, or it's something that's number 24. We ought to spend our money to cure poverty and malaria.
Thank you.
And I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mike. I don't know how you do it, but you always have a historical perspective on whatever it is that we are discussing. Next up is Julie.
Well, you've picked subjects. Okay.
Julie,
you picked interesting subjects that lead me into that.
Thank you, Mike.
You did only the 5 subjects I know.
Yes. Next up is Julie, Kondapoli, and Laura. Julie.
Okay, I remember this quote by Herbert Spencer. There's a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all argument, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That this principle is contempt prior to examination. And to me, I think that most people have a bias to rightness no matter what. And I think that they operate off of defaults that they're not even aware of. That's why they're so incongruous and inconsistent and crazy. They're operating off of erroneous things like blaming other people and being victims. And there's another way. And usually people hit a bottom at one point, and finally at some point, and might start examining these defaults. Or as Socrates says, know yourself, or Dr. Phil, how's that working for you? Because it just may be that our beliefs have a part in creating our reality. But a lot of people have a hard time stomaching that at first. But whether it's a business or a person, taking assessment, taking stock of what's working and what isn't, and being open to another way is I think that's something in common to a person who's happy or a business that's thriving. And I personally believe in looking at models that work a lot more than we do. I think Maslow liked it. Tony Robbins liked it. Leadership people are doing it, parenting, and learning what we can from them. And I think that those principles will be common to all different levels that we might be looking at. And I think they include humility, respect, openness, a value to truth more than being right, or more than the dollar bill as your value. And so that's pretty much what I say. I think, again, this call is a great model for politicians, for everyone, because not only on this call do you get to do your own assessment, but you get to have the synergistic benefit of all these different viewpoints that in these breakout rooms.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate that. Next up is Kondapalli, Laura, and Kevin. Kondapalli, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for today's session. I had a really good time. My biggest takeaway was, that what CJ said about contradictions being okay. I think that it was very important to acknowledge that we should not prioritize consistency above all else at the cost of considering multiple different opinions. So that was my takeaway.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kondapalli. Next up is Laura, Kevin, and Joel. Laura.
I can only say that I don't know how much I used to think, but right now I'm not sure about anything. I have to say that.
Okay.
This is driving me crazy right now.
That's okay. That's okay.
all I
Thank
can
you.
say.
Thank you, Laura.
You're doing it.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Kevin, Joel, and Joe. Kevin.
Thank you, Strankan, and thank you, CJ, for the great presentation. Yeah, my comments, we learned the theory from book and other resources. When it becomes our own knowledge, I would consider it is a hypothesis belief and understanding to solve our own problem. It is good practice used to what if to do daily task and adventure of our own thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up, sorry, I lost track here. Joel, Joe, and Hyro. Joel.
Thank you very much, CJ. It was a very thoughtful presentation. I just refer back to Heraclitus. No man ever steps in the same river twice. It's not the same river and he's not the same man. So whether we can truly have competing hypotheses simultaneously, I guess, is a theoretical construct that I might find hard to swallow. But if George were here, that great Jungian philosopher of baseball, he would remind us of a more modern philosopher who would say that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And that was Yogi Berra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. Next up is Joe, Hyro, and Linda. Joe.
I want to say thank you to CJ. It was a fantastic presentation. It was both sessions. And thank you to Shrikant. I have a lot of takeaways, but the main one is the idea of it being an epistemic virtue. And I kind of see the link to that. Because I had thought about it from the perspective of either having multiple hypotheses or single hypotheses. And we tend to develop beliefs out of these when we have a hypothesis and we get married to them. And then we're either going to be open to the answer or we're going to try and control the answer. And I think that is a really important distinction to make, is that if you have one single hypothesis and you're trying to make the data to fit your hypotheses, you're actually trying to control the solution. And that's actually detrimental to any type of scientific discovery. So I see that as having multiple hypotheses as an epistemic virtue and essential. I also think it's a lot more practical than people are thinking as well. I think that it is iterative. The idea of iteration is very important within this process, because the more you iterate, and that is a way of having multiple hypotheses, you're more open to the answer. You're constantly challenging what you believe. So I think that iteration is I have to figure out how that fits into the multiple hypotheses framework, but that's another aspect of it. And I also believe that that is ultimately, and gets to something that Sandy was saying, economically efficient as well. And I think that also allows you to not only come to a better solution, but I also think it'll, in the long run, it'll allow you to come to a more economic and a more holistic solution to a problem. And that kind of gets back to what Buckminster Fuller was talking about, in the idea that it is cost efficient on top of everything else to have something where you're incorporating as many hypotheses as possible. So where you're talking about micro-incisive specifically. So that's where I'll leave it for there. Thank you.
Joe. Next up is Hyro, Linda, and Shrikant. Hyro.
So I'm going to be working on that paper because I find it interesting, because I studied a little bit about Boltzmann's concept of reality, and it kind of does that, but in science, like looking at different scientific views of reality, and Boltzmann was trying to tell the scientific community to not just stay with one and throw the others away, but to allow all the others to kind of dance together. And so I find this, what this guy is writing, interesting. And I apply it to, if I'm not mistaken, I see the idea of having working hypothesis is to allow the different views to dance along and not allow anyone to take advantage and like push the other ones aside, kind of keep them well, eventually maybe the idea of the ruling theory is that society, or whatever a system is using them, is going to resolve to one and go with that one, and kind of leave the others aside, if I understand correctly. I don't know.
Thank you, Hyro.
Thank you.
Next up is Linda, Shrikant, and CJ. Linda.
CJ, thank you for an excellent presentation. I think having multiple hypotheses is such an important way of addressing issues. I think that we all need to be very aware, though, of our own biases, our own prejudice. It's so easy to have a favorite hypothesis and just push the rest aside. Thank you, CJ.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm going to first summarize what everybody has said. Now, it is difficult to summarize what everybody has said, but I'm going to try. Jeff talked about the importance of balance between confidence and humble, and being humble. Todd emphasized the virtue of humility. Sandy talked about groups, kind of working in groups as a solution to this. And the importance of knowing when to winnow things down, winnow the hypothesis down, and when to expand hypothesis. Lynn had this beautiful quote of, or not Lynn, Rick had a beautiful quote of, only humility is infinite. David pointed out that this approach enriches your explorations. Maritza pointed to the power of building this into you as a habit, and so that you are habitually stepping back and looking at it, looking at everything through multiple angles. Joe talked about overcoming the limits that we have of our language and our own consciousness by using multiple perspectives. Wayne questioned how practical is it in specific cases where we have to make decisions. Mark talked about this as leading to higher level of spiritual attainment. Jean pointed out that as we move into a globalized world, this approach becomes even more important. Mike started with, talking about the difficulty of confirmation bias, seeing teams as a solution to that, and gave a little bit of history lesson on the person who created these ideas. Julie pointed that most of us operate on defaults, and that is something that we have to watch out for, and learning from different models as a way of doing that. Kondapalli pointed out that most people are afraid of making contradictions, and that you need to be open to living with contradictions in order to figure things out. Joe talked about the distinction between an open system and a closed system and the importance of iterations. Jairo pointed out about the similarity between this approach and what Boltzmann was doing. And Linda was talking about the awareness of our confirmation biases. What I would say from my part is that one of the big tools that I use to check against my confirmation biases is Bayes' rule of explicitly making predictions and relentlessly checking whether those predictions have come true and using that to update my models. In addition to that, I work with multiple models, but a small number of them, maybe 5 or 6 at a time, each of which I'm trying to update and seeing how they are doing. And I'm always on lookout for new models and to replace the models that are not doing that well. So I find that is the general approach that I take. So that is my takeaway. Now, CJ.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your thoughts and your contributions in the breakouts. I think epistemic morality, epistemic means ever relating to knowledge or knowing. And we often don't think of knowledge as morality based, but of course it is. The right way to acquire knowledge, the right knowledge, the wrong knowledge, these are all epistemic moral principles. And Chamberlain in his paper explicitly calls it a moral reform. He really appreciated that science and knowing has a morality associated to it. And that's, I sort of snuck that in, and maybe that deserves a whole meetup to explore. And the ruling theories are, in one sense, ruling theories are a good thing. If we're very certain that Newton's law of gravitation works when, speeds are slow relative to the speed of light, for example, you might as well treat it as a ruling theory. But in most areas of our lives, when we're investigating new subjects, when we're learning as students, we don't know all the ins and outs. And at these points, as we're learning, we're not sure that Newton is right. We're not sure that Einstein is right. We're not sure Boltzmann is right. We're not sure Chamberlain. And the way to study, I think, Chamberlain's argument is the way to explore these situations when you don't know or when you're not sure is maximized when we identify and explore multiple working hypotheses. And I'm glad most people sort of got it. I would encourage you to read the Chamberlain article. It's very readable. You might need a dictionary to look up some words like WHET, wet, which means to sharpen. You might not know that word. There are a couple other archaic words and archaic spellings, but for the most part, the paper is very readable. And I want to close with some reflections on comprehensivism. As I've been, imagining, we started this series on Comprehensivist Wednesdays in July, and as I'm trying to imagine how to create a new tradition of inquiry and action to practice our comprehensivity. Bucky Fuller described it as our wanting to understand all and put everything together. If this is to become a new tradition of inquiry and action, I've been scouring my knowledge of the great traditions of inquiry and action, looking at all my communicated experiences, reviewing my awareness of the ethnosphere, our cultural zone, looking in all these sources for understanding it all and putting it all together. We've been examining this essay by T.C. Chamberlain about our investigating, our learning, and our civic life, and that we may more effectively ascertain the facts, draw conclusions, improve the thoroughness of our learning and investigating, increase our ability to see from multiple perspectives, and to acquire this mental dexterity to simultaneously see both analytically and synthetically at once. These are important benefits. And T.C. Chamberlain's moral reform of using multiple working hypotheses to, over time, acquire these mental skills seems to me to be very important for a comprehensivist trying to make sense of this enormous cultural heritage we have that we're called upon to integrate in our learning. Therefore, Chamberlain's essay is a great work for the library of the comprehensivist, even though I must admit he has a statement in there disparaging. He says, quote, compassing the entire horizon of knowledge. He says that no one thinks like that anymore. But that's exactly what comprehensivism is trying to do. Is so there's one sentence in there I disagree with, but still I would put it in my library for the comprehensivist. And we've discussed in this series other writings that belong in the library of the comprehensivist. I would put R. Buckminster Fuller's 1969 book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, and Wade Davis's 2009 book, The Wayfinders, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. And as I suggested at the beginning, Dante Alighieri's magnum opus, his Commedia, is also a foundational text for our nascent tradition of comprehensivism. These books all belong in our comprehensivist libraries. And so I hope you'll join me next year in reading Dante. Message me if you want to get my Dante announcements, or follow me on social media where I plan to post announcements. And I'll leave you with this question. What other writings belong in the library of the comprehensivist? Message me or post a comment to the event site. Do you have a favorite writing that should be included in the library of a comprehensivist? We'd love to hear about it so that we can inform our comprehensivity with a library of resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was magnificent. And thank you very much, everybody. This is always a pleasure to have such thoughtful conversation. Good night.